Hello, everyone. This is Dwayne Monroe with my co-host, Dennis Claxton. Our other co-host, R.C. Charles Roberts, is indisposed. Actually, he's enjoying a lovely birthday weekend. Today's film we'll be talking about is the Battle of Algiers. And what I'm going to do right now is read for you a synopsis from the Criterion Collection's description of the film. And by the way, the link to this will be in the show notes. This is about the Battle of Algiers, one of the most influential political films in history. The Battle of Algiers by Gillo Pontecorvo vividly recreates a key year in the tumultuous Algerian struggle for independence from the occupying French in the 1950s. As violence escalates on both sides, children shoot soldiers at point-blank range, women plant bombs in cafés, and French soldiers resort to torture to break the will of the insurgents. Shot on the streets of Algiers in documentary style, the film is a case study in modern warfare with its terrorist attacks and the brutal techniques used to combat them. Pontecorvo's tour de force has astonishing relevance today. And this is an interesting synopsis on the part of Criterion because it does indeed cover at a high level the events that are depicted in the film, but it aligns with the fact that many of the things that were occurring during the particular battle of 1956 in Algiers were events that were occurring for quite some time since the French occupation of Algiers in 1830. So it wasn't as if there was a peaceful situation in Algiers and then suddenly there was this battle and all hell broke loose. But anyway, I will now turn the mic over to Dennis. Hello, Dennis.
Hello.
Dennis has some notes that, and this is typical for Dennis, he has some extensive notes and things that he'd like to discuss about the film itself. And I believe you also have a copy of the script that you would like to go through. And Dennis, actually, what I would like you to do is kind of take the listener through the events of the film as you interpret them, and then we can go on, or go forward, I should say, into some of the other aspects or the larger things that are covered by the film.
Yeah, I think I could do that just with the screenplay because I have it kind of marked up and posted it up. So maybe I'll just go through and read some excerpts. But first, we talked about this before we started recording. I was listening to Electronic Intifada's podcast this morning, and this is from last Wednesday. And they have a summary of news, Gaza news. And as I was saying to you, everybody's talking about Syria and sort of confused, at a loss of what's really happening. And Gaza has been sort of not spoken about as much, but it's going on. The killing is continuing. And so here's a summary. I'm just going to read it. 12 December. Again, Electronic Intifada. This is a transcript, a portion of a transcript from their podcast from last Wednesday. Israel's campaign of systematic slaughter, forced displacement, destruction, and starvation in North Gaza is now in its 10th week, while airstrikes and massacres are being carried out across all areas of the coastal enclave. Palestinians in North Gaza endured more rounds of forced displacement this past week as Israeli forces ordered approximately 5,500 people sheltering in schools in Beit Lahia to go to Gaza City. The United Nations says about 8,000 people have been forcibly displaced to Gaza City from the northern areas since the end of November. On 11 December, an Israeli attack in Beit Lahia killed at least 20 people living in the multi-story home of the Abu Taravish family. On Tuesday, the Israeli army bombed a residential building in Beit Hanun in the corner of northeastern Gaza, killing 25 and injuring dozens more. The Gaza government media office that the occupation army quote, the occupation army knew that this residential building contained dozens of displaced civilians and that the majority of them were children and women who were displaced from their homes and civilian residential neighborhoods, end quote. In Beit Lahia, Israeli forces carried out a series of massacres in and near the Kamal Adwan hospital in the last several days. And then there's it looks like they have a recording of a news report. In a new massacre, over 30 killed or missing under the rubble of the Abu Tarabish family home, which was bombed by Israeli warplanes moments ago near Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza. And it goes on, but literally it goes on. So I wanted to, just sort of catch up on that, so we don't forget. And, but also, obviously we picked this movie for its own sake, but I mean, the connections with 2024 about to be 2025 are just all over the place.
And the question, and I should say, not simply, the question of the actions of an occupier, but the forms that resistance takes, and then the counter to that resistance from an occupying power. This is really the heart of this film, and a topic about the events in Gaza and then Lebanon, and indeed, that is often sidelined. In other words, in standard media, standard Western media, mainstream media, MSM as people say, the focus, if people are focusing at all on these events, they focus on it in terms of victim. But what makes people very uncomfortable, and this is why this film, I think, stands alone, is what is not talked about so much is resistance. So we talk about, in the case of the United States, for example, there's, in the cowboy and Indian mythology, right? People talk about how, the cowboys won, but the idea is that somehow it was wrong for, say, the Comanches or the Sioux to resist the encroachment on their territory of the United States. And the best that they're given in terms of any kind of regard is like, well, they're noble savages, but the idea is that they're savages all the same, and the U.S. had a civilizing mission, as France thought it did, of course, in its territories. The French phrase was mission civilisatrice. So,
if I could just for a minute, we have talked about this before about some of the rhetoric of the Indian Wars in North America.
Yes,
and one of the ones that I always remember, and this was not the first time someone had said something like this, I think, but it's there was one military commander who, justifying the killing of Indian children, American Indian children, said nits make lice.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And like I say, that is something that he's not the first person to say it, nor the last, because the Israelis are saying very similar things. There was the woman, the Knesset member a few years ago, that talked about little snakes.
Yes, and the Hebrew term amalek, for them and so forth. So, but with that in mind, go through the script, because I think that's what you wanted to bring to us next.
Well, it's interesting. I've been reading. I was familiar with screenplays sort of vaguely before we started doing this podcast. And I mentioned once it's very easy to find screenplays, so I have the entire thing.
Oh, cool!
It's about 140 pages, and it's interesting. And whenever I read one of these, and I've like I say, I've become more familiar with how they're structured. And I always remember a story I read about Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler. Raymond Chandler wrote 2 or 3 movies with Billy Wilder. Double Indemnity, the most famous, probably.
Yeah.
But this might have been an interview with Billy Wilder, I don't remember, but he was describing that when Raymond Chandler first started working on a screenplay, that he came back with this stuff where he was talking about zoom and all these camera kind of techniques and things that a screenplay, he didn't know what he was doing, and he was trying to figure it out. And Billy Wilder was like, no, this is not, And so when you're reading these, let me just read the beginning to give you an idea of how these things work. The screenplay describes a scene. It doesn't say put the camera here and put the camera there. So let's just start the beginning, because the film centers on a part of Algiers called the Casbah, which everyone has heard that,
that term, yes.
Yeah, rock the Casbah. There was a whole genre in the 50s and maybe early 60s of rock and roll songs that I know there's one that starts off, "Welcome to the Casbah." And then it's rock and roll, but it's this, sort of Oriental.
Yes.
And I sent you the Pepe Le Pew cartoon.
Yes. I did, yes.
And I had heard before that Pepe Le Pew was not a good role model, but my God, he's a monster.
Yes, and it's not surprising, because he's a French colonizer in the form of a skunk. It's quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just read the very beginning. Villa headquarters, inside, night. Inside a 3-story villa, just built, with whitewashed walls, an elevator shaft is empty. The large cables dangle. On every landing, 2 apartments. The front doors are wide open. Whitewash on the floor of the halls, swirls of whitewash on the window panes, naked light bulbs hung from electric wires. The rooms contain hardly any furnishings. The kitchens are still without sinks and stoves. An agitated bustle, a rhythm of efficiency, paratroopers, and maybe you know why they are called paratroopers, apart from obvious reasons. Paratroopers go up and down the stairs, pass along the halls, enter and leave the rooms. The sounds in the background are indecipherable. And then in all caps here, we have shouted orders, cries, howls, shouts, half-spoken remarks, laughs. Somewhere a gramophone is playing at full blast. The scene is tense, no pauses. So you get the idea, right?
Yes, indeed.
Setting the scene, literally setting the scene.
Yeah.
What these things do.
Yeah.
So the beginning of the movie, a character named Mark, one of the French soldiers, the colonel, where's the colonel? And paras, they say, for paratroopers. One says, why? What's happening? And Mark says, we know where Ali Lapointe is. One of them, quote, spoke, end quote. So this is the sort of crux of the action of the movie. Is it begins with this guy, Ali Lapointe, or maybe, am I pronouncing that correctly? Pointe?
Yes.
Okay. And so
the French probably would say like Ponte or something like that, but yeah, it's close enough. It's fine.
Yeah. So as I said, sort of the key to the action, apart from the bombings, etc., is the French trying to get this guy Ali Lapointe. And so in the beginning, you see him and 2 or 3 other people, one a child who's part of the resistance, hiding behind a wall, which he has built because he learned masonry either in prison or, growing up poor. He was illiterate.
And this is a false wall. And the entire purpose of this false wall is to provide cover for these fighters. Yeah.
Yeah, and it works very well unless you know they're there.
Yeah.
And so when they say one of them spoke, they've tortured someone to get this information, and we'll talk about torture later. And so the movie begins with the French authorities, particularly a commander named Mathieu, Mathieu, trying to get them to come out. And it ends. We're not concerned with spoiler alerts here, are we?
No.
It ends with them setting off a bomb,
an explosive, yeah,
and an explosive device, and killing them.
Yes.
So this guy. So the scene is set by starting with this guy being interrogated, and then they say he spoke, and then they come and. So then they're going to get this guy Ali, because there's another part that I have flagged here where this Colonel Mathieu talks about a tapeworm. And he talks about how it can grow to infinity unless you remove the body from the head. And that is still, with the beepers and with the assassinations that we see going on with Israel and Gaza now, that is still the, I guess, Western plan.
Yeah.
Is get rid of these leaders. And I mentioned I had listened to Colonial what is it called? Colonial Outcast?
Yeah.
With Greg Stoker. Yeah, he had a retired military US military guy on last week, and the guy said about this, he said, the US military, we change commanders, we rotate commanders in and out like all the time. He said, what's the difference? It's like, you take out General Westmoreland. Is the war over? No.
Precisely.
And so,
but I think that there's how would I put this? The belief that leaders are the source of the vitality of a movement has some degree of truth to it, because of course effective people can make things effective. However, there's also a racism built into that. So, for example, note how in the United States, there's always this talk about black leaders. Who are the black leaders? And it's an absurd idea because of and it seems natural. But no one ever talks about white leaders, right? Because the idea is that, every white person is a rugged individual, driving their Ford F-150 forever into the horizon. But black people need leaders because, so these are the individuals who can speak for the group. They're the articulate ones who speak for the masses. And the idea in counterinsurgency, that is to say, efforts by occupying forces or governments to destroy revolutionary movements, the idea is that, all of the energy of the movement comes from, these leaders who they may begrudgingly think of as being smart or a brilliant strategist or what have you, but who must be eliminated. And then once they're eliminated, all of the termites, because a term that the French used for the Vietnamese during their time in Vietnam, all the termites will scatter, because they don't have any ability to reconstitute at all. To recreate a structure. But groups always find people who are talented. You always find there's always somebody available, who will take command, as Stoker's guest was saying, whether it's in a official structure in which there's a chain, or there's just a natural. I think that Charles has talked about the fact that in the work of Wilfred Bion, he talks about the fact that groups always find a leader. No matter what, that there's a natural tendency of groups to find a leader. But this belief that, you cut the head of the snake off and the snake withers, it persists despite the fact that targeted assassinations, if they are effective, they're only temporarily effective. And yet, Western powers do this over and over and over again.
Well, before we started recording, you mentioned, or maybe after, I don't know, that technically the Battle of Algiers that's portrayed here was a defeat for the Algerian resistance. However, a few years later, because the prime objective with the strike that's depicted in the movie was to get the UN to talk about Algeria.
Yes.
And then that didn't happen.
Yes.
And then after this assassination of this killing of Lapointe and others, it was technically a defeat.
Yeah.
But as people are talking about, Tariq Ali mentioned this as well, that what has happened in Syria and subsequent events, it's a defeat for the resistance, for the Palestinians. Or for the movement, let's say. But he says, don't despair, because the Battle of Algiers, they lost, and a few years later, they won.
Yes.
Now we can talk about what's going on in Algeria and elsewhere in Africa. That's a different story now. But at that moment in the 60s, it was huge.
And that's a separate, well, it's not separate, it's a related topic, but it's a big topic, because then you're talking about, the flow of capital and how in the so-called post-colonial era, other methods were used to retain control. I mean, we note that France very recently was expelled forcibly from Niger, the source of uranium, for its extensive nuclear power program. But I don't want to get too far afield, because there's many avenues you could go down. I think that talking about the film specifically, one of the things that stands out to me about this film is that, unlike a standard kind of movie, in which, I have a story, I have heroes, villains, or there's some catharsis, the standard things that you see, like in either a drama or an action movie or a melodrama. This movie is a recreation on film of a series of frantic events that were both chaotic but also moved in a particular direction. Like, there was a lot of movement of which essentially were French forces, and the paratroopers simply means ideally airborne division troopers, because the French deployed their 10th airborne, I believe, and maybe a few other units in this particular battle over time, because they were considered to be typically, airborne or paratroopers are considered to be elite troops. They have the best training, the best weapons traditionally. But France devoted a lot of energy, into suppressing this, because they wanted to prevent the problem of having a good example for others, right? So what strikes me about this as a film is that it challenges the viewer to absorb a kind of a dialectical series of events, of ups and downs, that eventually, as you say, end in a defeat, but a defeat of the moment, but it's challenging in that way, because most films, there was, of course, the cinema veritas movements and various other movements of the 1960s, and that's, of course, when this film was released, during that moment when we were getting films that were trying to capture as best as possible, as best as you can with film, with cinema, real life, right? And try to take you away from the glitz and the glamour of Hollywood, as far as you could get from that. But it's a challenging film, I think, because it does require you to really pay attention to the fact that many events are occurring. What's your take on that?
Well, you were talking about the example, and I have a couple of things here.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned that when I first started thinking about this movie, it was at the suggestion of Tariq Ali. There was a meeting at the Socialist Worker UK group. There were about 600 people a few days after October 7th last year.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things Ali said is, if you want to know how these things, how a resistance movement such as this operates, he said, just watch Battle of Algiers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I got the idea. And then I started, the Socialist Worker UK website is very good. They have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of background info that is succinct and very helpful. So I have a couple of things. One, an interview with the director, who's Italian, by the way. I don't know if you mentioned that.
Yeah.
His name is Pontecorvo.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a screening. It was a long time ago, but they talked to him about the screening coming up in the UK, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he talks about the making of the movie in terms of financing. He says, so when I told my producer what I wanted to do, he said, quote, "You're mad. Nobody cares about those N-word."
Yeah.
Quote.
Yeah.
And he says, look, I told him, among other things, they're not N-word. They're as white as you and me.
Mm.
Quote.
Mm.
And then he says, due to a lack of finance, initially most of us didn't get paid. The technicians worked for lower wages because they believed in it too. And then the question, what kind of response did you get locally when you filmed in the Casbah in Algiers? And he says, people loved us. As I said, we didn't have much money, so local people helped out where they could. You see, bits of the screenplay had already been published locally, so people knew they weren't going to be portrayed as they normally were. That's why they gave us a hand.
Interesting.
So it was everybody involved, including, the people, locals. Everybody saw this as not a movie, but a missive, a communication.
Communication, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's another thing on that same website where the French troops ultimately win the Battle of Algiers and crush the FLN cells. However, the film ends with events several years after the defeat of the Casbah, with the mass uprisings that finally sapped the will of the will of France and its colonial settlers. The Battle of Algiers is without a doubt one of the best films ever made. More importantly, it is a how-to in organizing an underground movement, as well as the methods needed to defeat them. It is popular among revolutionaries. It is full of useful tips, and it was shown to U.S. officers during the 2003 occupation of Iraq so that they could, quote, understand the enemy, end quote. But then they go on to say, and, Ennio Morricone is one of those people that it just shows up. You're like reading about something, you're like, oh, there he is again. So he did the soundtrack for this movie. And everyone has wonderful things to say about it, of course. He used local sort of musical, what would you call them, motifs?
Yes,
as well as a piece from Bach, which I found. It's not that important, but Western classical mixed with local sounds. So it's and if you watch it, it's just it's just very sharp. There's no wasted time.
Yes.
And it lends itself to that kind of thing because in some ways, it's a police procedural, and that's one thing that came up in this the screenplay, which I can see if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. You get these little things with these voiceovers, and I noticed this in. I remember this very well from The Samurai. Is that what it's called? With Alain Delon as the assassin?
Yes, as the assassin, yes.
There are a couple of scenes in there where, and of course this is something that people would be like, no, that's not realistic, but it was at the time it was made. So his assassin character has a ring of keys of car keys. It looks like a giant jailer's key, an old-fashioned, with just dozens of keys. And he will be walking along the streets of France or Paris, wherever he was, and he finds a car with the door open. He gets inside. He lies down in the car seat, and he just starts trying different keys until he finds one that fits, and then he drives off. Then there is another scene when the police are onto him by now, and they go to his house, and they have a giant ring of keys with dozens of keys, and they go to his apartment and keep trying until they get into the apartment. The reason I bring that up is because there are these matching sort of voiceovers where Ali Lapointe is described in a police profile, and then there's a matching one of Colonel Matthew. That's the same kind of voiceover. So when his character comes in, okay, so we have the 3rd Regiment colonial paratroopers are now before the commissioner. Matthew turns his head slightly, and he says, attention, and then there's a voiceover. Family name, Matthew. Name, Philippe. Born in, tell me how to pronounce this, Rennes.
Rains.
Yeah. May 3rd, 1906. Rank Lieutenant Colonel. Schooling, Polytechnic degree in engineering. Campaign, Second World War. Anti-Nazi resistance movement. Italian campaign. Indo-Chinese War. Algerian War. So then that's the colonel. Here you have. And then they are talking and Matthew is speaking. Matthew's voice has nothing of the military and traditional. His tone is neither harsh nor cold, but rather kind and pleasing. From it emanates a superior authority imposed by reason and not by position. And then this is Matthew talking. The result is that in the last 2 months, they have reached an average of 4.2, there's a very precise, 4.2 assaults per day, including aggression against individuals and the explosions. Because by this time, there's a long scene where I believe it's 3 separate incidents. 3 women are dressed in Western style clothing. They act as if they're going to the beach or shopping or whatever. And at the checkpoints, they just pass them through because they're flirting with these 20-something guards.
Yeah.
And, they're carrying bombs in their bags or on their person. And they plant them in, I think there's one in a restaurant, different places. Okay. So, of course, the conditions of this is Matthew. Of course, the conditions of the problem are as usual. First, the adversary. Second, the method to destroy him. There are 80,000 Arabs in the Kasbah. Are they all against us? We know they are not. In reality, it is only a small minority, and of course they always believe this, a small minority that dominates with terror and violence. This minority is our adversary, and we must isolate and destroy it. So then there's, there's scenes where he is showing the organizational structure and about how he describes it as triangles, and how the people who are in the different cells don't know. No one knows everyone else.
Now, there's some truth to that French officer's statement that not everyone was against them, because they're always. And in the case of the Palestinians, we have the Palestinian Authority, and in the case of Algeria, there was, I believe, the organization was called the Union of French North Africa, which was made up of indigenous people or Algerians who had thrown in their lot with France. They considered themselves to be French and wanted nothing to do with any kind of resistance. And then there's Europeans who the French refer to as pieds noirs, who were Europeans born in Algeria and considered, if they were French citizens, or just Europeans in general, who were born in Algeria, and Algeria is what they knew, but they also were, of course, living in separate enclaves, in which they could retain or continue on, some version of the life that they would have had in Europe with Algerian servants and so forth. So,
Albert Camus was one of those.
Yes, indeed. So one of the challenges of any revolutionary movement is the fact that you will have a percentage of people, sometimes a rather significant percentage of people, who, and this is quite human. Most of us, as I think we were talking about, we just want to get on with our day, right? We don't want to be involved in, these kinds of activities, regardless of how terrible the situation might be for us, or if we are downtrodden, or if we are oppressed, or we are jailed, and all these things. We see this in amongst in Black America following Nixon's program to create like the mythology of Black capitalism, in which all you have to do is if you get rich, or everyone gets a great job, and then the problem of racism is solved. And this has convinced many people, despite the fact that nothing has been solved, right? So the state, or in the case of France and Algeria, the occupier can always depend upon a good cohort of people who will help. And so this was one of the problems that the FLN faced, was that there were indeed people within the Algerian community who would be against them, and who would fight against them, and who would rat them out.
Yes, of course. And even apart from that fact, there were people who were tortured.
And indeed, that's right. Yes.
And the person, as I said, the movie begins, you can tell that this person is distressed and has been tortured.
Yeah.
It's not made explicit, at the time. Later, it's made very explicit in a scene that's very difficult to watch.
They use waterboarding. Waterboarding was one of their methods, actually.
And torches.
Yeah.
Like, they would literally use a torch against someone's flesh.
Mm-hmm.
There's a scene with what do you call it when you clips electricity onto a person's ears or other
electrodes, using electrodes.
Mm-hmm. And the French, of course, they officially denied it for a long time, but
well, actually, let me take this opportunity and to read something that ties into that. And this is from a Wikipedia article about the occupation of Algeria. So, according to Ben Kiernan, who's an Australian-American historian, colonization and genocidal massacres proceeded in tandem. Within the first 3 decades, 1830 to 1860, of French conquest, between 500,000 and 1 million Algerians, out of a total of 3 million, were killed due to war, massacres, disease, and famine. Atrocities committed by the French during the Algerian War during the 1950s against Algerians include deliberate bombing and killing of unarmed civilians, rape, torture, executions through death flights, and the death flight that's referring to here is when the French colonizers would apply cement to people's feet and then take them on an airplane and then jump and then toss them out of the plane to die in the sea. Burial alive, thefts, and pillaging. Up to 2 million Algerian civilians were also deported in internment camps. Now, all of this should sound familiar to anyone who has studied the history of colonization anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world, these some of the details change, but the idea, and it's important to bear in mind when we think about the events of the movie, that France had been in Algeria since 1830, and from pretty much the very beginning began a program of brutality, to say the least, against the population of Algeria. And so the point here is that whatever one thinks of resistance and whatever one thinks of armed resistance, it is inevitable. You cannot simply be attacking people, brutalizing people, decade after decade, indeed generation after generation, and expect nothing to happen. And yet, inexplicably, because I guess we human beings don't really know ourselves too well, do we? People seem to be always surprised, angry, and astounded when their own violence produces counter-violence. It's like, how many more times, as we used to say when I was a kid, I'm not going to get hit in the face too many more times now before something starts to happen.
Right. And then you have the sort of, the other side of that is the famous thing that Golda Meir said is like, they're making us do this. I wish they would stop making us kill them.
Yeah.
It's just,
people keep telling me that I and this is why I have, it's the puzzlement over this behavior that kind of walked me back to a respect for psychoanalysis. Maybe not psychoanalysis as an area of practice, for you sitting on the couch, or laying on the couch, that kind of thing, but rather psychoanalytic theory about human behavior, because, we're such terrible creatures so much of the time, and we can use terms that do explain it, like racism and so forth, but that's not enough. There's something else, happening within us that needs to be understood.
No, I understand it completely, and I've learned a lot from our talks and my reading of Mary Wilde and Isabel Miller.
Indeed, yeah.
I told Mary the last time we did this that I believe what I said was, I'm beginning to understand why people reject psychoanalysis. Really, how it makes them so uncomfortable.
Yeah,
is because it just makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a way of making sense, and so I agree completely. I have, in fact, there's a lot of reading that I have avoided that I need to do. But you were talking about things that should sound familiar in terms of colonialism. There are things in the movie, as we mentioned earlier, that should sound familiar in terms of what's happening still in the Middle East and North Africa. And so let me continue with this scene where Matthew is talking to he's talking to soldiers. There are a couple of different. He's also talking to, I believe, local leaders. But here he's talking to the soldiers, and it's interesting because he is describing a police action. And when we talked about Gaza the first time back in February, we were talking about how Israel for years has not had an army. They've had a police force that mans checkpoints and snipers and surveillance and, not fighting. So he's talking to these soldiers, and he uses the word police actions or something to that effect. And then they cut to the soldiers and their faces, and he says, "I know you don't like that word," because it's like you're a fighter pilot and you're told to do something that is not Top Gun-ish.
Yes, exactly.
No, that's not what I'm here for.
Yeah, precisely.
I'm a soldier.
Yeah,
I'm not a cop. So anyway. And then they show a film. So here's Matthew speaking. He is an adversary who shifts his position above and below the surface with highly commendable revolutionary methods and original tactics. He is an anonymous and unrecognizable enemy who mingles with thousands of others who resemble him. We find him everywhere in the alleys of the Kasbah, in the streets of the European city, and in working places. Did I read a minute ago that someone said that this is a how-to
yes, indeed.
thing? Yeah, okay. So then he says to Martin, go ahead. And Martin turns on the projector. On the white wall next to the map and graph appear pictures of the Kasbah. There are the blockades, the barbed wire, the metal screens, the Algerians who exit and enter, the policemen and soldiers who examine documents and frisk someone. From time to time, close-ups of the pictures are shown, enlarged to the minutest details, close-ups of faces, motionless images that last only for a few seconds. And Matthew says, "I chose these films because they were shot in the hours preceding some recent terroristic assaults. And so, among all these Arabs, men and women, where are the ones responsible? Or there are the ones responsible. But which ones are they? How can we recognize them? Controlling documents is ridiculous. One who has everything in order is most likely to be the terrorist." So anyway, we must start again from scratch. The only information that we have concerns the structure of the organization. We'll begin from that. Skipping ahead, to know them means to eliminate them. There's that word. Consequently, the military aspect is secondary to the police method. I know we are not fond of this word, but it is the only word that indicates exactly the type of work that we must perform. We must make the necessary investigations in order to proceed from one vertex to another in the entire pyramid. The reason for this work is information. The method is interrogation. An interrogation becomes a method when conducted in a manner so as to always obtain a result, or rather an answer. In practice, demonstrating a false humanitarianism only leads to the ridiculous and to impotence. I am certain that all the units will understand and react accordingly.
Dennis, as an Angelino, you probably already know this, but I believe it was Chief Gates of the LAPD in the 1980s, if he was still in office at the time, who told his soldiers, his officers, that that was a Freudian slip, if ever there was. Told his officers that the way that you knew that you were dealing with a gangbanger was that they were neat and tidy. And when you were reading the line about that if someone essentially had their act together, that they probably were a member of the FLN, and therefore quote unquote a terrorist, it made me immediately think of the way the LAPD at that time, and how maybe even today, who knows, was categorizing mostly Chicano youth, but Black youth as well, as people who had like outfits, like just a white T-shirt or a shirt that was pressed, as a potential threat because it meant that they were part of an organization some kind of way, which shows that this mentality, which we think is even people who pay attention to it often don't make connections between the events of their day-to-day life, like the cop cities that are forming in the United States, right? The things that are in your very streets, and these methods, these techniques.
Yes, and this reminds me. Someone did a satirical thing of instructions to TSA agents,
Mm-hmm.
and it was what to look for in an airport.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember any specifics, but to give an example, it would be if someone touches their right ear, they're a terrorist. If someone touches their left ear, they're a terrorist. If they don't touch their right ear, they're a terrorist. If they do touch their left ear and their right ear, and it just went on and on. So yeah, and and the thing is, as I said, they show these close-ups of these soldiers' faces, and I think a lot of the people who played these parts, I think they were
yes, they were
or European tourists. I'm not sure.
You mean who actually were included in the film?
Yeah, I mean, so not everybody, of course.
Yeah.
Some
were, and others were people who actually had participated in the battle itself.
Oh yeah, the main character, one of the main characters in the Algerian, he went on to become an actor and a politician, as far as I know. I don't have his name in front of me right now. I can find it, but yeah. And so anyway, I was going to say that policemen in LA and soldiers in Algeria, they are so young, and so they're not. I mean, I think it takes 6 weeks of training to become an LAPD officer.
Really,
as little as that.
As little as that.
If I remember correctly, it's not very much. It's not enough. Certainly. Well, I mean, as if we're thinking that they're going to train them to be
actual peace officers.
Yeah, a friend of the people in the first place.
Yeah.
But I remember, I saw the last game of the World Series at this sports bar, they call it. It was on the Sunset Boulevard, near Dodger Stadium, actually. And there were so many people. The fire department came and almost shut it down. They made people go outside, and there were TVs outside, so they let people gather on the street, and watch the rest of the game. So you already had people on the street through the last third of the game. And then when the game was over, I don't know if you watched that game. It was the Yankees just fell apart in fantastic fashion. And so it looked like it was coming back to Los Angeles, and then the Dodgers come back, and it was just, so everybody was just going crazy.
Yes.
So then at the end of the game, we go outside, and there are all these people on the street, and it wasn't anticipated. So you had buses that had to either stop and just
right, yeah,
leave the bus there, or try and turn around. And then the police showed up.
Yeah, of course.
And we had to really take the long way around because the police wouldn't let us go back to where we were headed. Anyway, I'm looking at these cops, and they're just kind of lined up, and they've all got their hands on their batons, and they're all just ready to just bust somebody's head. And that's all they're doing.
Yeah.
Because one of the buses that I'm talking about, I remember seeing it, and then I remember we got out of there. I said, let's get out of here. This is too.
Yeah.
There were fireworks, and it was just.
Yeah, exactly.
And it turns out that bus was burned. Now, whether it was an accident where fireworks got it, or someone purposely set it on fire, but I'm thinking, what are these cops doing? How can they just let somebody get on a bus and set it on fire? That's not their job.
Yeah,
their job is to make sure that they don't miss any opportunity to hit somebody over the head.
That's precisely right. Yeah, because of course, what you would expect. I mean, in the fantasy world, what like a peace officer would do is like, well, people are excited. You have number one, you have common sense. You're like, this happened, people are excited, people in the street, tell people to disperse, or you just kind of watch the situation, make sure there's no property damage because folks are drunk or whatever's going on. But there are ways of handling basically a nonviolent crowd that's just a bunch of rowdy people. I've seen it happen here in the Netherlands many times, in which, although the cops have been getting a bit more rambunctious, as my grandmother used to say, recently, a little too baton happy. And this, unsurprisingly, this follows some of the pro-Palestinian protests that happened here. And then cops got a little too baton happy. But there are methods for handling crowds, just to keep the flow of, say, traffic going, right? And make sure that, as I said, no one's breaking a shop window, which is typically not the kind of thing that would happen. Or if it does happen, it's usually frat boys or some jackasses like that who are actually doing it. I remember in Philly, every time people said, well, every time the Eagles win, or if the Eagles get to the Super Bowl, or the Phils get into the series, that, people burn the city down, which is not true. What's typically true is that suburbanites come into the city and act like complete jackasses, right? And then people think that there are, city folk who just like to, burn things down. And this is the result of the racism. These ideas come from the fact that people are always expecting, and the cops are always expecting, to have to deal with people who they not see as people. They see them as insurgents who must be suppressed, because they spend all their time only around other officers, and they're indoctrinated in a way of thinking, and they have no normal life, outside of this world.
Right. You mentioned people coming in from the suburbs and creating a ruckus or being rambunctious. The cops come in from the suburbs in Los Angeles anyway. Most of them do not live here. So not only do they not live here, but there's a tradition of hiring people from, people might recall the Rodney King, the officers, one of those officers, or more than one, were from Kansas.
Interesting.
And there's a long tradition of Los Angeles. I don't know what the numbers are now, but in the 60s, there's a woman that I've often mentioned, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, a historian from Oklahoma who came to school at UCLA. And she talks about one event in particular where she was with some people on the street, and the cops thought that they were, it might have been American Indian movement people. It was some activist kind of thing going on, and the police were worried, and so they walked up to this group and started, asking questions. And Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz detected an Oklahoma accent, and he said, she said, "Where y'all from?" And it completely sort of diffused the situation, because she ends up talking to these cops about Oklahoma. But speaking of Rodney King again, the trial for those officers was not held in Los Angeles. It was in Simi Valley, which is a bedroom community full of cops.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So not only do the people causing trouble in Philadelphia come from out of town, so do the cops.
And it's almost kind of like an internal, and this is a term that Black radicals used to use in the 60s and 70s, like a form of internal colonization, right? Like the logic of the colonizer is brought home. And this always happens in which whatever methods, we mentioned cop cities a little while ago, whatever methods are employed against subject populations eventually find their way home. And in my viewing, in my experience, the way it works, and I'm sure there's scholarship on this, and just plain, just observation. First, an external, quote unquote, threat. Methodologies are used. Then an internal threat. Maybe the extraordinary measures aren't as extraordinary, although sometimes they are. And then even the individuals within the population who are considered to be the good people also become subject to these methods, and then eventually everyone has to be worried about their safety from the authority itself, right?
Well, yeah, that kind of poison happens with prison towns, they call them here in California as well. We can talk about this in terms of how many prisons have been built in California in the last 30 years. But it became a thing for these small town leaders to say, hey, here's a way to make things better. We'll have a prison. And it never improves the economic situation of the town because, again, the officers don't live there.
Right.
The infrastructure is built by people obviously not from these small towns, and the supplies come from outside the small town. So the only thing the town gets is a few men get hired as officers and go home and beat their children. It's just juvenile delinquency increases. This happens over and over again. It does not help the town. So, just the criminal justice system in the United States in general, every aspect of it, there's a toxic residue just all over the place. We can talk about this on another program someday. There's a prison movie that we might do. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, the topic of prisons, I think, is quite rich. Are you familiar with the film noir Brute Force?
No, is that with Burt Lancaster?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's well worth watching because I think it may be, to my knowledge, it may be one of the first films, and it certainly is a noir, that deals with prisons in terms of power dynamic. In previous films, I think typically, the warden is portrayed as this kindly uncle who's trying to help, Johnny get back on the straight and narrow, and talks in that kind of cornpone way that some actors were trained to talk in the 1930s and 40s when they were supposed to be good, quote unquote, good people. And Brute Force, I think it's Hugh Cronin, plays the warden, and he's a monster. He's just an absolute monster. And the monstrousness of the system that these inmates find themselves in is portrayed with almost no punches pulled. It's a quite shocking movie for the time in which it was produced. But I see.
Go ahead.
Well, I see that we're at the hour mark, and so I want to give you a chance.
You're kidding already?
Oh yeah, time.
Oh my goodness.
So
okay, well, there's one thing I wanted to do.
Yeah,
and I feel like I've taken up all our time with this.
Well, that's fine because I think it's because of the nature of the movie, in which you can't talk about it in a standard plot-driven way. I think that going through the screenplay was wise.
Well, I have one last thing from the screenplay.
Please,
if you want to.
Yeah, please.
So, we keep saying this all sounds familiar. Here is something that won't sound familiar because it is Colonel Matthew talking to the press. And they are asking real questions and he's giving real answers. That's something that doesn't happen anymore.
Indeed.
They move to the landing and begin to ascend the stairway that leads to the second floor. The journalists have difficulty keeping up with Matthew. He says, "Look around. I put everything at your disposal. Go take a look with your own eyes." A journalist says, "The strike is a success, but..." Matthew says, "No, it has failed in its objective." And that's one thing we didn't mention, that a centerpiece of the movie is a strike where where people stop going to work, they stop shopping, they just basically stay home.
And one of the purposes of the intervention was to force people to return to work and school.
Yeah, get back to work, just like after 9/11, COVID. Every time it's like, well, we have to get back to work. So anyway, Matthew says, "No, it has failed its objective." And the journalist says, "Insurrection?" Matthew says, "Insurrection." Another journalist, "But the NLF has always spoken of a strike as a demonstration." Matthew says, "And you believe the NLF?" The journalist says, "They seem to be plausible this time. A general strike is a good argument for the UN." And Matthew, of course, says, "The UN is very far away, dear sir." And this is critical. It is easier to make oneself heard with bombs. If I were in their place, I would use bombs. Now, you listen to that and you watch it particularly, and it's kind of chilling, because another difference between this and Gaza, the Israelis have bombs. They are using bombs for over 430 days now. It's just incredible when you realize how long it's been.
Yeah, if you had told me prior to that we would be witnessing just an unfolding horror, I wouldn't have believed it. And not because I have faith in our societies, but I would have assumed like the Reagan gambit of the 1980s would have been used, in which the U.S., thinking selfishly of its own geopolitical position, would have, halted it after a period of time. I think it's a testament to the deterioration of the U.S.'s position in the world, despite it possessing a capacity, of course, because, you still have weapons and it still has the dollar, but despite possessing these things, but it is an indication to me of a deterioration of competency but also of position, that rather than calling off your vessel, you allow to persist, and because you think that this will solve the problem once and for all for us, and maybe it's the result of having a sclerotic chief executive, perhaps, but it may also be the fact that the nation as a whole, even if the president was 25 and doing 1,000 push-ups every morning, that the nation as a whole, as a project, is sclerotic and has reached a point of increasing desperation, which seems impossible, but all sorts of powers have seemed, as Ursula Le Guin says, power seems ineluctable until it no longer does, and then you're like, oh well, what was that? I'm sure the people who were walking around the ruins of Rome at some point were like, well, they really did have quite a time, didn't they? But it's all done, which doesn't mean that that there's no cultural effects after effects, but you couldn't summon any legions anymore to do anything. But I was also thinking, we also didn't mention the United Nations angle of this, which was that the FLN, as we've been saying, or as the French put it, the NLF, for National Liberation Front, that their theory, their idea was that their action would bring their plight to the UN, and therefore there would be international action on their behalf. And this was a naivete, a terrible naivete that we also saw, I think, in the case, and I will actually, let me retract that word. It was a calculated risk that there was an international community, after all. And I think that the Palestinians made a similar calculation, that there was an international community, and that we would take this action that would put us back on the table, a military action on 7 October that would bring us back on the table, and that the world would say, oh yes, we now recall that there's this open air prison, as former British Prime Minister David Cameron said years ago. And now we'll take the resolutions and maybe a peacekeeping force, these kinds of things. I think that's, and also the prisoner exchange was apparently their expectation. And no one could have guessed that the level of deterioration and depravity was what it indeed is, what it indeed proved to be. Because just as the Algerians thought, there is a United Nations, and one can understand their hope, because the United Nations coming into being, the defeat of the Nazis, I think many people believe that there was indeed a new world being born, because after all, what seemed to be the greatest evil, the fascism of Nazi Germany, being defeated, you would think that, well, there's a new world, yeah, and then it's like, well, no, actually, it's the same world. They were militarily defeated for geopolitical reasons, really having nothing to do with any hatred of fascism on the part of the the powers that defeated them, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union, which of course had to face the true meaning of that, when they invaded their country, when the Germans invaded their country. But I think that was the calculated risk that the Algerians put it into their plans that did not turn out the way that they thought, just as the Palestinians also took the calculated risk, which not because of any shortcomings on their part, but because of the shortcomings of the world as it is currently structured, has failed them utterly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Although Tariq Ali does say that people who might not have known what's going on in Palestine, in Gaza, they know now. They can't say they don't. They can't say they don't know.
This is true.
And a lot of people. Well, I think obviously it had a big impact on the presidential election.
I think so.
I don't know if it was a difference maker, but it certainly had an impact.
It had an impact of some sort. Yes, it definitely did. And I think that the idea of Israel that I was raised with, which was this outpost of peace and civility and what have you, and lovely people, with gardens and all of that, and tan pretty girls and this sort of thing. I think that's shattered. I think that's gone, and that does not bear fruit immediately, but it will bear fruit at some point.
Yeah, you know what? I think one last thing from the screenplay that fits in very nicely here when we're talking about public perception. And also a shout out to Charles, our resident Sartrean. So here we go. This is continuing with Matthew, the colonel, talking to the journalists. Matthew says, in Indochina, they won. A journalist says, and here? Matthew says, it depends on you. The journalist says, on us. You aren't thinking of drafting us by any chance, are you, Colonel? Matthew leans his hand on the door handle and smiles at the journalists. He says, no, we have enough fighters. You have only to write, and well, if possible. One journalist says, what's the problem then? Matthew says, political support. Sometimes it's there, sometimes not. Sometimes it's not enough. And then he says, what were they saying in Paris yesterday? One journalist says, nothing. Sartre has written another article. Matthew gestures and makes an expression as if to say, see what I mean? At the same time, he opens the door, but before entering, he turns again to the journalists. Will you kindly explain to me why all the Sartres are always born on the other side? A journalist says, then you like Sartre, Colonel? Colonel says, not really, but he's even less appealing as an enemy. So, we can end it there, I think.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to end it. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of today's show. I want to thank my co-host, Dennis Claxton, and R.C. Charles Roberts, our co-host who is on a brief sabbatical. So, on behalf of my co-hosts and myself, Dwayne Monroe, I thank you for listening and bid you adieu.
Yeah, I guess we should say see you next year.
Oh, indeed, yeah, because this is the last show of 2024, and I won't make any predictions about 2025. Let's just see what the gods in their cruelty bring to us. Bye, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.